Thank you guys for coming to this session. This is Debugging Diversity. My name is Anjuan Simmons, and I'm really happy to be here at Strange Loop. And I want to start with a story. Several years ago, an actor on a television show faced a dilemma. He was the star of a TV show that wasn't doing all that well in the ratings, but that wasn't the problem. This actor learned that an actress who also starred on the show was not being paid as much as the other male actors. Now, this actor was beloved by the fans, and that gave him a lot of influence. So he went to the studio executives and used his influence to demand equal pay for this actress. And he was successful. The actress received pay equal to her male peers. The television show was Star Trek. The actor was Leonard Nimoy, who, of course, played Spock, and the actress was Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura. That's right, Leonard Nimoy was down with equal pay for equal work way before it was cool. Nimoy used his influence to fix a defect in the TV industry. He debugged pay for Nichelle Nichols. And by fixing this bug, he furthered her position as an actress, which gave her access to better pay. Now, you may be wondering, what does this have to do with a conference like Strange Loop? Well, you may have heard that the software development industry is not all that diverse, and that we suffer from a lack of diversity. Whether it's open source or closed source, developing code or deploying code, the people working in software development do not reflect the general population. And rewards like pay, promotions, and positions of leadership are often not equally distributed. We face the reality that a woman working today in software development who has mastered tools like GitHub, Ruby, and SQL has less access to equal pay than an actress on a failed TV show from the 1960s. However, I believe that Leonard Nimoy provided a model for how we can address this problem. Notice that Nimoy did not wait for Paramount to roll out a better pay program, nor did he wait for his superiors to create a better salary policy. Nimoy acted based on his sense of fairness. Nimoy lent Nichols his privilege as a male actor, and he helped her participate in the financial benefits of his gender privilege. And I think that there are a lot of Leonard Nimoys out here. And I think that there are other ways to debug the diversity and inclusion challenges in software development. Now, one key thing that we have to understand before we get into debugging diversity is understanding the difference between diversity and inclusion. And there is a difference. So imagine that you're throwing a party. Diversity is sending invitations to your guests. That's easy to do. You pop them in the mail, you're done. However, inclusion goes further than diversity. Inclusion means not just inviting people to your party, it's making sure that they feel welcome and comfortable at your party. You understand that some of your guests had to make a longer journey to get to your house, and so you're a little bit more welcoming when they arrive. You may also realize that some of your guests have food allergies, so you have different meal options for those guests. Or some of your friends might not drink alcohol, so you have non-alcoholic options for those guests. So that's inclusion. Inclusion requires empathy. And that means that you take the time to understand that people are different. Diversity is easy to game, and we see a lot of big companies doing that. They release these big numbers, and they really say, well, we're doing what we can, but the numbers never change year after year. We see companies like Google and Facebook fail to really make change. But I think that the work is important. I think that shooting for a more inclusive technology industry will pay better dividends. You know, Leonard Nimoy saw that a big company like Paramount could not solve the problem. And I think that it will take a grassroots movement of everyone in this room, everyone in technology, to really affect change by acting on our sense of fairness. Now, we work in tech, right? And we had the benefit of understanding how grassroots movements work. Open source software was a grassroots movement in software development. And one of the first books on open source software is a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric S. Raymond. And this book starts with Raymond exploring the miracle of Linux. Now, most of us use Linux every day. We don't really think much about it, but when it was first being written, it was this miracle. It was this complicated kernel that you let everyone contribute to, and the hope was that you would create a useful operating system. And it worked. There are many Linux distributions today. So Raymond, in his book, analyzed the principles of open source software that he saw in Linux development and applied it to his own work. And he had two models. There was the Cathedral, which is the centralized, very buttoned down, tightened down development model that you see in closed source development. And he contrasted that to this Bazaar, this open source model that was this babbling, boisterous area where it was loud and power was distributed, but it worked. And not only did it work, but the Bazaar model featured better outcomes than the Cathedral model. Now, one of the most famous quotes from this book is this: "Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow." And I hope that some of you have heard about that phrase, and if you haven't read the book, it's a really quick read. But I like the more formal version of this also in the book, and that's this: "Given a large enough beta tester and co-developer base, almost every problem can be characterized quickly and the fix obvious to someone." That is a statement of inclusion. Raymond linked the size of the co-developer base, which is kind of an old term, but the size of people contributing to open source software, to innovation and the ability to solve problems, which is the heart of innovation. So if we let software development be this big, boisterous bazaar where everyone's welcome to come and contribute, then I really think that there's no problem that we can't solve. But while that's the promise of inclusion, that we can have a total industry where we have the power to solve any problem, the sad reality is that just like our repositories are protected by permissions and passwords, often our companies are protected by privilege. And there are voices that we keep out of this bazaar because we don't create a space for them to take part in our projects and in our companies. And there are certain groups that have a hard time lending their voices to the babbling bazaar that Raymond described because they lack privilege. And this is really tragic because whatever problem you have, either in your source code or however you ship software, there's someone out there who knows how to fix it. But often these people are denied entry into our companies. But I think that if you've taken the time to learn the skills necessary to develop software, you'd be surprised how you already know, maybe even intuitively, how you can debug diversity in technology. And I want to go through how we can use those techniques in this efforts. Now, the debugging techniques that I hope everyone is familiar with are expected behavior, tracing, refactoring, and sample code. And let's look at them one at a time. So I work with a team of about 15 software developers. I'm a program manager, and I make sure that we have the projects laid out and that the team knows what they're working on, what's important, and ultimately that we ship software to our customers. And we work very closely with our QA team. And we always have to remember that the first step in understanding a bug is what's the expected behavior? What should the feature do? And likewise, the first debugging technique that we can apply to fixing the inclusion problems of technology is the principle of expected behavior. We can't understand the problems caused by a lack of inclusion in tech without understanding, well, what's the expected behavior in technology environments? What should people do in tech spaces? Now, I have male privilege, and whether it's a workplace or a tech conference like this one or a happy hour, people who have male privilege in tech, we benefit from this pattern. But we often fail to see how people who don't have male privilege are denied those benefits. I have a friend named Catherine. Well, I follow her on Twitter, so we're kind of best friends. Catherine founded a very popular website called The Muse. And she's a successful startup founder, and she shared an experience that she allowed me to repeat. And I've heard this from many women who work in technology. And this happens on a regular basis. So she goes to a happy hour for founders, and she walks into the room, and people are having drinks, and obviously there's usually a lot of men who are in the room, and she might be the only woman who's in the room. And so she walks up, and more often than not, Catherine, a founder in her own right, will have someone turn to her and say, "Oh, whose girlfriend are you?" Right? So she did not get the benefit of the doubt that those who have male privilege experience. And women and people of color and LGBT people often are exposed on an almost daily basis to behavior that those of us who have gender privilege would never expect. So the ability to see these lapses in behavior, that's vital to helping everyone understand that we should stop prejudging people only because they defy the patterns that we're used to seeing in tech. And those patterns are based on gender and race and sexual preferences. Regardless, everyone should be given the basic respect of possibility, that this person is possibly as capable as I am in technology. So that's that debugging technique. We should keep our eyes open for what should we expect? What levels of respect should we expect to give to everyone, regardless of what they look like? Now, the second technique is tracing. And often when you're running code, it's hard to really know the output, so we often trace. We turn tracing on. We might put the output to a file or to a log. And just like you can trace code to find the small defects in it, you can turn on your inclusion tracers and see the often subtle ways that marginalized groups are excluded from information and often exposed to microaggressions by the dominant demographic in tech. This is Erica Baker. She works for Slack now, and she's been a very visible advocate for trying to fix the diversity problems in technology. And she shared her experience of being the only black person on the team and having a white coworker make ridiculous assumptions about her. He would say, "Well, is your boyfriend beating you? Did you come from a single-parent household?" And this person seemed to be so fascinated with her fictitious history of abuse and neglect, but he didn't even get to know her. And often on other teams that she worked at, she would have to go to beer taverns, and she didn't even really drink beer, but to fit in, she had to learn classic rock songs, which if you like classic rock, that's great for you, I guess. But, she felt like she had to lose her identity to be able to fit into tech. And, this is not unusual. Often, people of color in tech, we have to lose our lives to make a living. We have to hide our identities to fit into technology. But if someone had their inclusion tracers on, they could have spotted this. For example, we shouldn't assume that everyone wants to drink alcohol. And even though there's an alcohol culture in technology, we should be sensitive to people who don't drink alcohol. And everyone here can kind of walk through the cultural code of your workplace and think about, is anyone being hurt by our culture? Are there things that happen that if we simply paid attention, we would see that, we're making this environment uncomfortable for certain groups. All right, so let's turn to the inclusion principle of refactoring. And we all know what refactoring is. You want to change the internal structure of the code, maybe make it easier to read or easier to maintain. And we all kind of want to fall into the allure of new features, but I really believe that you make legacy code easier to maintain by refactoring. And so how do we refactor our cultures in technology? How do we do inclusion refactoring so that we can make the technology industry a more inclusive one? How do we change the internal structure of how underrepresented groups are viewed in tech? So let me give you an example of how we can refactor inclusion. A few years ago, a famous tech founder gave an example of how he interviews people for work. And because he worked at a big company, it's stuck. And you may have heard of this, but it's called the airport test, right? And that's the idea that when he interviewed candidates, he would make a decision on would I want to be stuck in an airport with this candidate. And so, that's kind of weird because, one, this person who was a white male probably doesn't fly with a lot of black men or black women, and so you're already kind of selecting out certain people from this airport test. And this is really a terrible way to hire people if you want a diverse workplace. For example, how does a hiring manager's personal taste determine if someone is a fit? Right? That shouldn't be an issue at all. Just because you like sitting in an airport and maybe you're into Pokemon or maybe you're into whatever, your cultural expectations have no relevance on how successful that person can be. And if your culture is mostly white males, then guess what groups usually fail the airport test? And so I think we can refactor the airport test. And instead of looking for who would I want to be stuck at an airport with, let's look at who would be really an amazing person on my team. Let's look at how we do our job descriptions. Let's look at how we ask, okay, this is the work that we want this person to do, and totally wrap the selection process around that. We probably want to ask, well, how have you solved problems at other workplaces that you've worked at? How have you reduced the amount of bugs that are reported after release? Those are the types of questions that we should use when interviewing candidates. So let's refactor the airport test and let's make it into the rockstar test. How can we create rock stars at our companies who will really contribute to what we do? And by doing that, by creating this rockstar test, we take the I out of the selection process that the airport test really makes you have to think about, and we replace it with the needs of your company. So let's stop trying to hire these cultural fits. Let's hire people who can really be rock stars at our companies. So the next diversity debugging technique that I want to talk about is sample code. And one way to debug code is to simply see a sample of code similar to it that runs well. And in many ways, another programmer lends you code to help you make your code better. And of course, this could be a production code or code you have running in a local branch. Now, just like you can lend code to another person, you can lend privilege to someone else. And by doing that, you can help underrepresented groups get access to information and events that naturally flow to the dominant demographic in most technology companies. So men at technology companies, you can help women know about that basketball game that everyone plays Thursdays after work that the women just don't know about. Just let them know. Just lend the privilege that you have as a man in this bonding event. Or you can, when you're in a group of men talking about tech and there's a woman there, you can say, you know what, I want to know what Susan has to say about this. Because often when we have conversations, we don't give women the benefit of the doubt of being competent. And there are times where I've seen the woman who wrote the code standing there, and they're talking about the code, and she's not even in the conversation. And I lent privilege a few years ago. I've spoken at South by Southwest Interactive, that's a conference in Austin, Texas, several times. And I was putting together a proposal for South by, and it was a dual idea, a dual panel where two people would present. And one key thing about getting a panel successfully accepted into South by is having a great co-presenter. And there were a lot of white men who I could have went to. But you know what? I said, you know what? I have this young lady who I work with on a program at a company, and she does design. And so my proposal was a design-related panel. And so I was like, you know what? I have male privilege. I've spoken at South by before. I could probably find a couple of white guys to present with me who have a lot of visibility, but let me lend privilege to her and see what happens. And so we talked about it, and we worked on the proposal together, and we got accepted. And so Anna Karen, that's her name, was able to go to South by Southwest and speak. And then the next year after that, she proposed her own panel, and that got accepted. And now she's involved in startups and doing work, and it's really a great benefit to be able to be a woman, she's from Mexico, to go into an investors conference and say, you know what, I just spoke at South by Southwest, let me tell you about my company. So what can we do with these debugging principles? Well, before I go into that, I want to talk about Common. This is Common, who's a rapper. And I spoke at GitHub Universe a few days ago, actually, right before coming here. And Common was the person who performed at a benefit for Black Girls Code that the conference had. And it was a great concert. Does everyone know Common? You know, the rapper? That might be my black privilege talking that I know who Common is. He's an amazing performer. And while Common has a lot of hits, one of his songs that I like the best is called Glory. And it's from a movie called Selma that's about the civil rights movement. And one of the lines from Glory is this one. And it goes, one day, when the glory comes, it'll be ours. It'll be ours. And I like this song because it really captures the essence of why I think that diversity and inclusion is so important to do in technology. Because when we make technology a more diverse and inclusive industry, that doesn't mean that white women win, or black women win, or black men win, or LGBTQA people win. It means that we all win. Because in every movement in our nation's history to advance the rights of the disenfranchised, we've seen this. A few weeks ago, a brave Muslim American father famously offered to lend someone the copy of his Constitution. And you probably heard about this. And in response to this, the ACLU offered anyone who wanted a copy, a copy. So I got my copy a few days ago. And so, you know, I'm reading through the Constitution, which I haven't read since probably 8th grade. And I'm thinking, you know what, this really holds up well. And I then realized that the founders of the Constitution put a pull request system into it. And the idea is that you could take changes, have them reviewed, and then deploy to production. These are called amendments. And it's a really rough, messy process, and that's why there's only been 27 of them in 200 years. But you know, just like in software development, version 1 is pretty cool, but really the pull requests are where a lot of the meat lies. And so when I looked at the amendments, I saw a pattern. For example, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution is famously known as the one that ended slavery. But when you read the 13th Amendment, it doesn't say that you can't enslave black people. It said you can't enslave anyone. And so as the descendant of black slaves, I'm sure my ancestors rejoiced at that amendment. But really all Americans should have rejoiced because they now lived in a country where everyone was surely free. And when the 17th Amendment gave women the right to vote, I'm sure half the population was happy that they were let into the franchise. But really all Americans should have rejoiced because we lived in a nation where your gender was no longer held against you at the ballot box. And when the Supreme Court fairly recently declared that same-sex marriage is marriage and therefore should be protected, I'm sure a lot of gay and lesbian couples rejoiced. But really we all won because we now lived in a country where there were no limits placed on love. So as a nation, we tried to form a more perfect union by addressing the wrongs done to underrepresented groups like people of color and women and LGBT people. But I really think that we can form a more perfect software industry by addressing our own peculiar problems. When we build software as a place where everyone is welcome, no matter what you look like or who you love, then we'll all win because we'll work in an industry that puts no limits on talent. One day, when the glory comes, it'll be ours. It'll be ours. Now, I want to go into a few takeaways that we can use to hopefully put this into action. And I want to talk about awareness, action, and then being an ally. So awareness is something that I think a lot of you are already doing because you're here. You came to a debugging diversity topic at Strange Loop. So I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I think we should put our awareness into action. And so like I said, I try to lend my privilege as a male in tech by helping those who don't have male privilege. And often if you meet me at a conference and you present as a woman, I'm probably going to say, hey, have you ever thought about speaking at tech conferences? Because I know how hard it is to get here. I know how hard it is to stand behind this podium. And some of you may know me, I probably said you should speak at conferences, and I probably encourage you to do that. And so that's what I try to do. By being aware of the disparities in our industry, I really try to see what I can do to lend my privilege to others. A few months ago, actually last year, I went to a conference called Craft in Budapest. And there was this woman that I met who has a startup that helps students in foreign countries format their resumes for English speaking hiring managers. And I encouraged her to speak at Craft next year because I think she has a great voice. And so that's how I try to have my awareness turned on. And I also encourage action. I know that whenever I give this talk, people ask, well, what can I do to act? And not only that, most people say, well, there are times where I want to debug diversity, but there are certain groups that say, you know what, I'm good. I don't need the help. And my response is that this is not a silver bullet. Just like debugging code, there's not one way that you can always fix every bug. There's not one way that you can always fix diversity and inclusion in tech. And a large part of what I try to do as a person who acts in technology to try to make it more inclusive is to really just listen. I try to listen to underrepresented groups and hear what my fellow women in tech are going through, what LGBTQA people are going through. And then after you listen and spend time trying to understand their experience and their journey in tech, you can begin to ask, well, okay, I understand that as a woman in tech, for example, this, and this happens. What can I do to help? And there are times when they're going to say, I'm fine, I don't need the help. But if you really listen, and if you take the time to do the work, they'll eventually say, you know what, in the past few meetings, I didn't feel comfortable talking about something because of, I didn't know if it was going to be received very well. Maybe if that happens again, can you just kind of turn and say, hey, I'd like to hear what, I have to say. And so I found that by listening and then by asking, that to be a very effective way to be a better person who can lend privilege in technology. And, I understand the trepidation that some women feel about male allies. And an ally is a loaded term. I'm going to go into that in a little bit. Because to be honest, horrible things sometimes are done by men to women in tech. And those are things like microaggressions, or there are times when women don't get promoted and they see their male peers being promoted and they aren't. And there are times when women who have gone through that may not think that men are going to be allies, and you have to respect that. You have to just say, you know what, I'm here to listen. I'm here to act in whatever way you think is appropriate. And I think that that's one way to act is to listen and then ask and then act. And being an ally, being an ally can be a loaded term. And, we have to be honest with ourselves. Whenever I say that I'm a male ally, I have to be honest that I live in a culture that is really anti-ally. We live in a world that regularly reinforces misogyny, sexism, racism, often in very subtle ways. And to think that that doesn't have an impact on us is really being naive. We have to understand that by living in this world, that we have all this noise of inequality. And while I believe in the total equality of the sexes, and I try to fight to help women get into tech and be successful, make sure they get equal pay for equal work, make sure that they get promoted when they should, I have a subconscious. And I understand that that subconscious often is fed garbage by the real world. And so you're always going to be an imperfect ally. You're always going to be someone who is an ally in progress. And we have to understand that. And by doing that, you're empowered to say, oh, wow, I still have those really dim views of women that I thought that I took care of. And let me think about that. Let me really ponder that. Let me see how I can remove this way of thinking from myself. And so by realizing the struggle of being an ally, you're able to confront it head on. And you can then continually become a better ally. And I always tell people that being an ally is not a marathon. It's a sprint. You have to take the time. I'm sorry, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. I said that backwards. Someone caught that. Yeah, did you mean that? Yeah, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's going to take time to do the journey of understanding what we can do to become better allies. And so just like our software won't be bug-free overnight, and our industry won't be inclusive overnight, by working together, by chipping away at the problem, I think that we can all make a better technology industry. And maybe one day, it will be the meritocracy that we want it to be. Now, I know that some of you may remain unconvinced. You may say, you know what, I just want to write code, dude. I got my tool set up, and I got my compilers running, and I know how to get code into production. This diversity and inclusion stuff, that's nice and hippie, but not really something that I think that I should care about. And I understand that thought. But I would imagine that when Leonard Nimoy walked into the offices of Paramount to talk about Nichelle Nichols getting equal pay, I don't have any proof of this, but I'm sure that a couple of the executives thought, what does paying a black woman have anything to do with making a sci-fi TV show? And I would hope that if Leonard Nimoy was posed that question, that he would say, it has everything to do with making a sci-fi TV show. Because Nimoy played a character that symbolized the power of infinite diversity and infinite combinations. And I would hope that he would think that by creating an industry where everyone feels welcome, that they'll be equally paid, they'll be equally rewarded, they'll be equally respected, that's worth fighting for. And I think that if we want to see our industry become more inclusive, if we want to see women, LGBTQA people, people of color come into the industry, get promoted, if we want that babbling bazaar where no bug is deep, then I think that we can all have a role to play by debugging diversity. Thank you. And I think I have about 7 minutes for Q&A, so shoot. Yes, at the back. Right. Yeah, so I think the question is, often there are, women's networking groups in companies, or there's networking groups for black people, and what can we do to give the example of a women's networking group, maybe bringing men into that group? So I have a couple of responses to that. One, I totally get the need to have safe places where you can go to people who share your struggles in tech. I've been a member of different groups for Blacks in Technology. There's a Black in Technology event actually later today. And so you want to have that safe space where you feel comfortable either as a person of color or in LGBTQA communities or as women, where you can kind of let your guard down a little bit and really be honest in sharing. I actually think that instead of bringing men into a women's networking group, it's better for men to become more aware of what women go through and around men talk about those items, right? So, it's really easy for a man when a woman's in the room to talk about, inclusion and how the industry is misogynistic and all that. But what happens when you're with your boys and you're talking about work and someone makes a rude comment about a woman? Do you correct that? That's really what's more important. I think it's when people who have privilege are in a room with people who also have that privilege. Let's have the conversation about the people when they're not in the room. Men should talk about, you know what? How are we paying women at our company, right? Have that conversation and call people to the carpet. And these are hard conversations to have, but I think that that's where the power is. So when men are with men, that a conversation is had about what can we do with the experience of women at our company. Maybe the company's great. Maybe the conversation is everything's well, but that, of course, requires men to be aware, to have those traces on that I talked about, to be able to be aware of what's happening. And I encourage men at my company to think about, how their women at our company acting. Did that kind of touch? Okay, thank you for the question. Let's see, with the blue hoodie on, I think, or shirt? Yes. What's your name? What's your name?
My name is
Lashana, hi.
First, thank you for this Star Trek reference, the inner Star Trek fan. I'm very happy.
Right. 50 years of Star Trek, by the way, this year? It's 50 years of Star Trek. Yeah.
Star Trek this year. I was wondering, as a ally, as you being an ally, what are some of the oppositions that you face? Because we always hear that people are lending their privilege over, but I never know what oppositions you may face as an ally when you're trying to do that in spaces of other people that have that privilege.
Yeah. Has everyone heard of Model View Culture? It's a publication. If you heard of it, raise your hand. It's a great magazine. I think that becoming aware is reading, doing your homework. I highly recommend everyone subscribing to Model View Culture. It's a really important publication. A few months ago, Model View Culture did a study on being an ally and being an advocate for these topics in tech and improving the culture of tech. And the study was based on a survey, and the results were obvious. It's exhausting doing this work. Often people who are marginalized by the system have to fix a system that they didn't create. And the burden of doing that is tough because often it's like you're being asked to clean up a mess that you didn't make. And I think that, in my own personal work, I'm very active on Twitter. I gave a version of this talk called Lending Privilege at GitHub Universe a few days ago. And so I'm actively talking on Twitter about my talk and how I think it's important that we have allies and that we try to make the technology industry more inclusive. I know if I ever want to find a job, there's some hiring managers that may think, this guy's a revolutionary. We don't want him to be in our companies. And so there are probably jobs that I may have been passed over for because I'm an advocate for making technology a better industry. I probably want to work for those companies anyway, but there is a price to be paid by being an ally. I think it's worth it. Technology is an industry that I love. I love tech. I always have. And if I can find some way to make, especially for Black women and women overall, but I know that being a double minority, you're almost doubly taxed. I think it's worth it. I think that there are benefits to leveling the playing field. And I really do believe, and I can share studies with anyone who wants to. You can @ me on Twitter. Let me go to my last slide. And I will be happy to provide links. But there's ample evidence that inclusive teams are more innovative teams, that there are business benefits to being diverse and inclusive. And so I think that fight's worth it, okay? Thank you, Lashana. I think I have time for one more question. Let's see. Let's go to the woman on the end. Yeah. So let me make sure I understand your question. You're saying, how do you reach out to underrepresented groups and want to help them, but without putting the burden of the help or of fixing it on those groups? Yeah, it's hard because I often advocate, like I said, for women to speak at tech events. I think speaking at tech events like this is really great. Helps you be seen as an expert, makes you more visible. If you ever go for a job interview, having a recording of you talking about the job you're being interviewed and like the task that job is asking for is really powerful. I also think that, Sally Ride, the astronaut, said that you can't be what you can't see. And by having women on stage at tech events, I would hope that women walking by, maybe young teenage girls, can say, "Oh, wait a minute, there's women at this tech conference. Maybe I can be in tech," right? Because I think often there's that thought that tech is very much a male-dominated field, and only men should be in it. And that's unfortunate. But I also know that by being on stage, you are taking on the burden of fixing the problem. And I think that all that I can do is try to create a more understanding industry so that that burden gets a little bit lighter. So that's why I give talks like this. That's why I do what I do. That's why I hope that people respond to or they subscribe to Modern View Culture. And there are lots of great people who are doing work to be more in this Project Inclusion, Project Include, which are two separate projects. There's work being done to make the burden lighter so that as we get people into this movement, we all have a little bit less work to do. All right? Thank you so much. I'll be around. Feel free to come up afterwards, and I'm happy to talk with you. Thank you.